But I'm not seeing any sound. You're not getting sound.
Well, because I have it muted.
Yeah, might be why. Right there.
Huh? No.
The red one. Yeah.
What? If he went.
Unmute.
He was taking it seriously.
There we go. Now we have sound.
Now he is.
Okay. All right.
He wasn't taking it
We're back online theoretically.
Theoretically, we'll see anything. You have anything? Yes.
So Mahesh made a really good point. He was talking about how when he nods off in these talks, he feels the energy. And that's really the entire point of everything we've been talking about. Experience, reality is an energetic presence. That's all it is. And so feeling that fact, feeling that all there is here is energy, is tuning into reality. When there seems to be anything else, when there seems to be objects and things and events and all these things you can qualify, that's when you're looking at the energy, but you're not recognizing it as energy. You're turning it into all of these. It's like the difference between looking at a movie in a movie theater, all you're seeing is light. And if you know you're seeing light, you're just seeing light. It might look like Indiana Jones and whatever else, but it's actually just light. And that's exactly the point. So you may think, oh, I'm in a room here and we're to talk. No, you're in a field of energy, and that is perceiving itself. That may look as if, and is describable roughly, as if it was a room with people talking, but in actual fact, it's not. It just plain is not. And the important thing is not the theory of that, but to see the way in which that is in fact so. See it self-verifyingly. And by see, I mean just, have by intelligent engagement, discover the way in which that is self-verifyingly so.
Even though there's only one thing here and it's experience, there are textures, so there seems to be different qualities about things like gradations.
Absolutely, there's an infinite range of textures.
And because there's this range, there seems to be this distinction or separation.
Well, you can try and make distinction by categorizing different aspects of the bandwidth, but it's arbitrary because you're drawing lines where there are no lines.
Well, the operative word is seems.
And it's like looking at a rainbow or looking at a spectrum of light that a prism refracts and saying, oh, there's 7 colors. There's not. There's one spectrum. And you can start drawing lines and you can count as many colors as you want depending on how many lines you draw. But there's no lines there. All there is colors. There's a continuum that is infinitely differentiated. And this is a continuum that is infinitely differentiated in the way it presents itself to itself, but it does not depart from itself one tiny bit. So none of these differentiations are actually separated in one iota from any of the other differentiations.
So when I notice a density that seems to be distinct or be a distinct density, right? Then the thing to do is to look into it and notice how even within that density there are gradations.
There's always infinite gradations. Just looking at gradations is a really good way to deconstruct apparent entities. All entities are constructed of infinite gradations. Gradations only come in one quantity, infinite. No, it's a simple fact. Look at it.
It's good though.
Well, it is good. It's totally good. It's powerful and it's really useful. You know, look at your face in the mirror or look at the back of your hand and say how many colors are there. And you will discover it's an infinite gradation. You might argue that it's a relatively narrow portion of the bandwidth, but in fact, it's an infinite gradation within that narrow bandwidth, if it is even that. Because energy does not come in discrete flavors. It comes in an infinite range of infinitely multidimensional flavors or qualities, apparent qualities. None of which are even the tiniest bit removed from presence of self. In other words, my formula you probably heard me say over and over and over here. It presents as infinitely differentiated, but it does not depart from itself. It's always exactly this that looks like this. But in looking like this, it is still just this. And that's an aspect of the irrational portion of it, because the logical mind wants to say, no, it's differentiated, or no, it's the same, and sees that as a dichotomy, but it's not a dichotomy. The way what this actually is, that is not a dichotomy. That is clearly and self-evidently how it is.
So I was a big fan of The Flash. I'm wondering why. Why it is we can't walk through walls. You know, I mean, it's all energy and.
Well, it's all energy, but the energy orients itself to itself in the way that it does, rather than in the way you may think that it ought to.
Right.
Light of a certain intensity will shine through a window, but it has to be a whole lot more intense to shine through a wall. You know, you put a nuclear explosion right outside the wall, you'll probably see it. You know, you put a candle outside the wall, you probably won't see it.
Right.
But maybe you will. Maybe you'll see it in other ways, because the engagement of the energy with itself is infinitely multidimensional, and there's not just one pathway or one dimension of engagement present necessarily. Because you might know it psychically in some sense, or you might. I mean, who knows what? I mean, there's no way to try to delineate these things, because they aren't actually separate things that you can delineate. But we have all these terms that supposedly refer to something, and that's what these terms refer to.
So the studies of walking through walls or flying or walking on water, are these just metaphors? Or?
No, nothing's impossible, but that doesn't mean you can contrive it.
Okay. Force it.
Right. Anything can happen if it happens.
But they could be metaphors too.
But sure, they can also be metaphors. A lot of the ones in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, for example, are metaphors. But you can't pin that down as being this way or that way, because you can't pin anything down as being this way or that way. Because there are no walls. Walls are perception. The wall you see here is existing exactly as much as the wall you see in your dream. And both of those exist exactly as much as the no wall you see when you're in deep sleep. They're all the same thing. So there's no way of predicting before the fact how that's going to present, because physics and all that is just coincidental.
just coincidental, right?
Yeah. What's it? It's circumstantial evidence. It happens to be. It looks as if there's cause and effect, but that doesn't mean there is. For example. Because nothing exists in one mode only. Everything exists in infinite multiple modes. So yeah, your body is solid matter and the wall's solid matter, so you can't walk through it. But your body is also quarks and the wall's also quarks, or maybe, neutrinos that are moving forwards and backwards in time at once. So maybe you can. I mean, because all these things coexist and the implications of each of these perspectives is drastically different. But things don't exist as one way or another way. Things simultaneously coexisted in an infinite range of actual ways that is discoverable, each of which has very different implications.
Yeah, but there is no cause and effect seems to be the easiest path to joy.
Yeah, and it's not the cause and effect is negated. It just is there are infinite other alternative modes that the same events can be seen in terms of.
Well, it's kind of like relaxing the need to find cause and effect. You're saying, well,
Sure.
there may be a cause and there's an effect, but do I really need to know it? No.
Well, it's trying to, like any of these things, is trying to constrain your perception in terms of a narrow range of interpretation.
You can't get anywhere with cause and effect without putting some sort of brackets, artificial brackets around the experience, because you have to limit it in some way for there to be a start to the cause.
Yeah.
To the effect.
I mean, everything's caused by the Big Bang. What caused the Big Bang?
Right.
I like to just think about it, or ponder the weather. It's the whole just atmospheric weather, but all of that is happening. What causes what? Does the wind blow or does the wind suck?
Yeah. It's a mutual resonance of apparently diverse conditions within a single system, and the system functions as a dynamic interactive resonance within itself. And you can't, it's not like this portion is causing this and this portion is causing this. It's, or look at, I mean, any systems are complex and subtle. And ultimately, if you look for the cause of anything, you end up with everything. If you're really, honest about it and thorough, because you can't exclude anything. I mean, why, what made this cup? Well, it was made in some factory, probably in China or something, right? So why is the factory there? Why are there people working in the factory? Well, they're working in the factory because the atmosphere exists and they can breathe. If there was no atmosphere, they couldn't breathe, and the factory wouldn't exist, and there'd be no cup. So the atmosphere is the cause of the cup. Why is there an atmosphere? Well,
Yeah.
where does it stop? And then with quantum mechanics and modern physics opens the door to all sorts of new, non-classical causalities of synchronism of energy systems, across a distance that have essentially nothing to do with each other.
Yeah, and for me, there's the start of karma, which is it had to start off mutually.
Well, the start of karma is ultimately
Promise.
interpretation.
Yeah.
When you stop interpreting, that's the end of karma. It's not the end of patterning, but patterning is not actually patterning. You know, the real solution of liberation from karma is the discovering that patterning is made of non-patterning. So all this intense patterning that constitutes all the circumstances that entrap you and that you're stuck with are all made of non-patterns. They're all made of infinite fractals that aren't actually findable as being anything. And if they're not really anything, how can they make anything that isn't anything? You can't make a something from a nothing or an anything. And so everything, you know, and this is not just logic. This is experientially discoverable. So everything that seems to be patterned is not actually patterned because you can't pin down what the pattern actually is. You can say it seems to be patterned, and if you don't look at it too closely and sort of take an average or a simplistic view of it, you can say it's patterned. You can say, well, you look the way you look, and you look like Mahesh, which is that, you know, kind of this. I can come up with a paragraph describing what you look like, right? But what do you really look like? You know, well, you're fuzzy. I can't say what you look like. You're fuzzy, and I can't pin you down, and you're ambiguous, and this color is almost this, but it's almost that, and it's not really either of them. And I mean, the whole thing, you're down the rabbit hole in terms of just this barrage of qualities that don't stabilize into a coherent whole. They don't stabilize into like a strong attractor in chaos math terms. You know, on the contrary, they diverge, and the closer you look, the more divergence you find. And so the more I study what you look like, the less I'm going to know what you look like. Because it's just going to be this, how do I put all this information together? It can't be done. And that's the truth. And that's what all patterns are actually like that. All patterns are, you know, anything you think you know as being a certain way, you're oversimplifying. And if you look at it, you know, and I say look, I keep using these visual metaphors, but that doesn't necessarily mean visually. If you look at the pattern in terms of what's actually there, you'll discover that what's actually there completely and utterly transcends what you're used to thinking of it as. In other words, this is more just in terms of quantity of information, let alone in terms of resolvability of qualities.
Examine is a good word instead of look.
Examine, sure, examine is a
Because
very
then
good word.
it's not visual, it can be anything.
Yeah, experientially engaged.
I like it, man. Just time. What I say, he goes and finds another word. Examine and recognize, okay?
All right,
Okay.
examine and recognize.
Explore.
Get rid of it.
Oh, yeah, explore, I like explore. Okay,
And when you discover that, you discover the way in which there are no patterns. And there goes your karma. If it doesn't negate the apparition, but the apparition is not what you're used to thinking of it as being because you can't say what it is. And as soon as you start saying what it is, you're oversimplifying. You're talking about a caricature of it, which is not it. You know, a stick figure of someone is not them.
You can do that with any experience.
Any and
I
all
mean, you can come up
experience.
with any scenario
I mean,
and break
yeah.
it and take it apart and notice how much bigger and
Yeah.
nebulous it gets.
Yeah,
Like,
patterning.
like finding a screw that fits a particular thing, but then all of a sudden there's a screwdriver, there's the hand, there's the space it's in, there's the item itself, there's the place you bought the screwdriver. All of a sudden you can't pin it down to anything, you know, it gets bigger and bigger. Like looking at a planet from space, there's no boundaries, no houses, no people.
This is the whole issue of resolvability. The fantasy of resolvability is exactly the fantasy that patterns are resolvable.
Right.
You know, you can only know what something is if the pattern that it is presenting as is resolvable. If you can say, now I've looked at it really closely and now I know everything about it and this is what it is. And that is always a fantasy. That's always a lie. It's always an assertion that is incomplete. And the actual condition always completely and utterly transcends that, hence negates it, cancels it out. It's not that that oversimplified version isn't arguably there, that's there, but there's so much there that transcends that is to make it laughable. And then that's what liberation from karma is structured as. Because karma is a non-existent structure. And for karma to actually be karma, it would have to be an actual structure.
But there aren't any of those, right?
It's like a dream, it's like supposing you're trapped by the circumstances of a dream. Just look closely and you'll notice the dream-like quality of all the elements that are representing in the dream, and how trapped are you by them?
Right.
And it's exactly likewise here in the so-called waking condition.
So when I move my finger across my jeans like this, I think I notice the pattern of like a certain distinct texture. Like
Sure.
I think I'm noticing certain threads.
Sure.
Or that's the image that comes to my mind.
Sure.
And
you are. But there's more than that.
As you're saying, it's just energy, or what do you mean when?
Well, ultimately it's energy, but even if you want to look at it as being threads, this thread is this thread experienced from that angle, but you move your finger like one electron quantum shell over, and you're feeling a different angle. So is it the same thread? Is it a different experience? The notion that there's fixed threads that are just lying there objectively is a fantasy. The threads are experience of threads, and experiences happen when they happen, which is always in the instant from the perspective of that instant's experience, which is continually shifting. As you say, your finger's moving. So how many different locations does your finger go over? 3, 5, 10, a billion.
But wait, even more so. What you're feeling, why are you calling it a thread? You can call it a finger. Because
call it anything. Call it
feeling
anything.
your finger.
But ultimately it's energy because it's just experience. And you can't parsing it, trying to objectify it as being, it's threads or it's my finger is absurd. The only thing you know is it's experience.
Yeah, don't pin it.
And is experience a thing? Try and find the thingness of experience. I mean, it's not nothing. It's not chopped liver, but it's actual. It's actual, but what is it?
Dreaming about chopped liver.
I mean, I call it energy, just not because that defines it, or that's even a particularly meaningful way to refer to it. But it's a way that immediately and intuitively and evocatively counters the notion of things and stuff that's actually sitting there that actually is a certain way. Put it this way. Suppose you're dreaming and you run your finger over your pants. How many threads are you feeling? Are you feeling them with your finger? And are you feeling them with your finger? And the whole thing just, it's not, you can see clearly that it's not like that. It's not the way it seems to be from that simplistic perspective if you're trying to objectify that as an objectively existing condition. And this is exactly the same way. All objects are experiences of objects, so they're not even objects, they're just experiences. The of objects is a supposition, it's a theory, it's a hypothesis. I can hypothesize it, and when I see this cup, there's an actual cup that I'm seeing, but that's just a hypothesis. All I know is the seeing. I could see this cup in a dream, and all there would be there was a seeing. I wake up and I know the cup wasn't there, all there was the seeing. But in the waking world, we somehow stick with that hypothesis, and even though when I go to sleep, the cup disappears, just like the dream cup disappears when I wake up, somehow I don't connect the dots and get that this cup is only here because it's being a seeing too. The waking world disappears when you go to sleep just as thoroughly as the dream world disappears when you wake up.
the dream world still seems to be present in the waking world.
Sure, and vice versa. They're just different apparent densities, you might say, and trying to pin down what that means and how that works, of course, is impossible. But trying to pin down what anything means and how it works is impossible, so there's no surprise. You know, again, you have this infinitely apparently differentiated spectrum, let's say, of energy that reality consists of. That can consist of infinite gradations of apparent density, infinite gradations of apparent flavor and various axes of maybe color and texture and sound, and I mean, who knows how we can analyze as many vectors of axes of analysis as you want. But all they are is analyzing degrees of difference of this with itself, within itself. So the apparent density of experience in the waking state and the apparent, more ephemeral nature of experience in the dream state, that's again degrees of density within the bandwidth. Who knows? And you can't pin down what any of that is anyway. So.
Puts me in mind of that Christopher Nolan novel, The Last Blizzard of Something Co.
Oh, yeah.
It could just be anything it wanted to be, and it transformed.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
One day it was a monster, the next minute it was a travel trailer.
Yeah,
and,
that's a good book.
and it just, there was
Something
no rigidity there.
Yeah. But your experience is like that. Your experience is continually transforming itself. Every instant, whatever you're experiencing is already morphed into something else, and you're never going to experience it again. So it's just, if you look at your experience, it's just this continual ongoing morphing that is never any one way, because it's already something else, and none of it ever repeats. So it never comes around again. So you can't even know what you did experience at the time.
Actually, we kind of limit our experience by labeling things, because one thing that I've experienced from every once in a blue moon is something I'm looking at that I can't figure out what it is. I can't define it. I'm seeing shape and color. And then suddenly its identity as an object of whatever kind comes into focus. And I can't go back to having it be nebulously an unidentifiable object. It remains a thing I labeled it. And that's what we do.
Yeah, that's what we pretend to do.
Well, that's what appears to happen in mind or consciousness. Pretty cool trick.
Well, what about the situation of, it kind of sounded like what you just talked about, like you're living with the sort of interpretive framework of something being, whatever, like a superstition or something. Like I remember there was this one time I was driving my motorcycle in Taiwan in this cemetery, and it was at night, and I was thinking, oh, I believe in ghosts, whatever. And then this, like, and I was like, oh, I shouldn't be afraid of whatever, even though Taiwanese people would be terrified in that situation. And I was driving along, and this big black dog just ran out of nowhere and started, like, was barking and chasing after me like he was going to bite me. And I like screamed my head off. Right? Because I was like, I was under the, like, so the dog for a second there, it was like some demon that was chasing me. And then there was a switch, and then it was the dog. But there was, right? So that's like, what can be said about that? Or like if you're,
Well, like you said, it's an interpretive framework. And even that it's a dog is it wasn't the ghost, it's a dog is another interpretive framework. That it's a motorcycle in a graveyard is an interpretive framework. All it is apparent patterns of energy, apparent patterns of light, apparent patterns of sound.
It was actually a monster.
But it's like it slips into from one interpretive framework into the other, and then it stays in that other interpretive framework.
Doesn't have to stay.
But at the same time, it's infused with whatever the pure energy of the bastion, or it's like because there's been this flip, there's the energy is very present in a certain way.
Yeah, well, that's the advantage of surfing interpretational frameworks, because you discover their arbitrariness.
Mhm.
Even if you're moved from one interpretive framework to another, in other words, it's not any more real. It's still just an interpretive framework. But the fact that you shifted, your nose is being rubbed, and how arbitrary it is, which makes the actual energy content of the event more obvious.
What do you mean by surfing interpretive frameworks?
Letting yourself notice that you're actually slipping between different and contradictory interpretive frameworks, right? So you can kind of navigate these things.
Seems the whole question of whether something is quote real or not real is just sort of irrelevant.
Well, if it's irrelevant, but they're all interpretational frameworks, i.e. fantasy projections.
But it just doesn't seem to matter.
Of course it doesn't matter,
So
but if it's a phenomenon that seems to be present, then you can use that phenomenon for the purposes of investigation.
I'm not sure what you'd be investigating.
You'd be investigating the way in which you weren't actually stuck in these interpretive frameworks if you were under the mistaken belief that you were.
Which we are.
Well, it seems like I just don't care about them anymore. It's
Well,
just
of course, so you don't need to investigate them.
Yeah.
But if you did care and you felt stuck in them, then you might be interested in investigating and discovering a way to not care. And then you would feel less stuck, in case you preferred feeling less stuck than feeling stuck. But it's all arbitrary.
It's kind of like this not caring, so to speak. It sort of came about. If it even came about, it's sort of like something disappeared more than something happened.
But it disappeared. Right, but it disappears from seeing.
It disappears from
Discovering their irrelevancy. By seeing the irrelevancy, by seeing that they have these interpretive frameworks have essentially nothing to do with the actual context.
Well, again, it's kind of like that whole interpretive framework or concept of time, the whole notion of it. This doesn't have anything to do with it.
Right, but you can only say that because you see it. If you thought the time was very real and you can hypothesize, maybe there's a way in which it isn't, but you still feel like it's very real, you don't have any conviction in saying it's not because you can't see the way in which it isn't.
I think, well, there's a couple of things about that.
So, the fact that you can say that, and it has nothing to do with time, means you can see, in some sense, that that is the case, in a powerful sense. Or else you're just saying it because you like the sound of it and you're pretending.
It's like that whole, like before, like I was saying, I really was digging into this whole question of what is time, how long is now,
Sure.
Right? All of that good stuff.
Sure.
And at some point, I don't know, it didn't happen like in a big flash or anything, but at some point it just kind of like, it's like I'd wake up in the morning and I'd start to maybe go down that path, and it just like, what path? It ain't there.
Yeah, but you discovered that it isn't there. You discovered the arbitrary nature of that perspective, so you didn't need to deal with it anymore one way or the other because it's arbitrary. But before you had discovered it, it may not have felt so arbitrary. It may have felt like something relevant to look into.
Yeah, it did.
And it's the seeing, it's a discovering that that's not the case that freed you from the urgency or the relevance of approaching it in those terms.
Yeah.
And I mean, in whatever sense you would put that, or in whatever sense it may have occurred.
It could happen all by itself.
Well, sure, it happens by itself, but ultimately, it's a discovery of that is the case.
Sort of unhappens by itself.
Sure, unhappens by itself. Yeah, sure, whatever.
Because it's not like an event, at least in my experience of it.
No.
Like there's nothing there.
Yeah, but seeing that there's nothing there, or knowing that there's nothing there, is what makes there be nothing there, or what enables you to access the fact that there's nothing there in the face of all these people around you who are saying there's something there. You know, you go up to your average guy on the street and say, "Hey, there's no time." You know, they're gonna look at you like you're nuts, or maybe argue with you, or maybe, shrug and walk off, but who knows? But very few people will go, "Yeah, sure." Because most people just reinforce each other's arbitrary consensus reality assumptions and language without looking into it very much or questioning it, apparently. And the fact that you can see through that, indicates that you have seen through it. And perhaps by trying to see through it or exploring the issue, or through whatever apparent cause events or not.
However that not seeing through it or that seeing through it, whatever happened is completely unknown to me. I have no
Well,
idea.
sure. Well, it is. It is unknown.
I mean, totally unknown. It's like, I can put it.
Sure. But that's true. I mean, because
Everything, right?
huh?
It's true everything.
Exactly. And when you see that that's true of everything, then that's seeing through it. I mean, it sounds paradoxical if you try and put it into words, but of course it's irrelevant, because when you're pretending to put it into words, you're just bullshitting anyway, because it cannot be put into words. And attempting to put it into words is only useful to seduce one to the ultimate realization that it can't be put into words.
Yeah, it's my claim in traffic has nothing to do with whether or not I get hit by a car.
Absolutely.
There is but one thing. And there isn't that.
Interpretive frameworks, well, actually, I'm thinking more about words right now because I'm teaching my granddaughter to read and write, which is really fun.
Well,
It's so much fun, seeing kids connect up words and playing around with them. And
sure.
But
And that's the genesis of how interpretive frameworks are generated.
Yeah. But I just sort of, I'm not one of these people that's, I like interpretive frameworks now because they come up and it's like those things that we were saying, like, the wow stuff when you're, take on LSD or something when you're high. Now sometimes when they come up, I almost want to laugh because it's not exactly, it's not real, but I like that contrast.
Sure.
To see it. Like, for instance, I just, the last 10-15 minutes or so, I had a really low blood sugar. And so I've been trying to work with Jeff, trying to get this network up.
Right.
And what I wanted to do is, okay, well, now supposing we could connect even up to the Ethernet, but I couldn't think of the word connect. It was such a mind blower. You know, it just, I guess that happens probably when people get Alzheimer's too.
Sure.
It's sort of, but those moments are fun in a way.
Well, they're
because
totally fun.
You just have to, you totally see that this word is just sort of bullshit compared to what's really
You see, it's all a
going
game.
on.
It's all completely a game.
Yeah,
But people have forgotten all these things are games and they think they're important and urgent.
yeah.
You know, it's as if you believe that the monopoly is real, and it really, really matters whether or not you pass
Right.
go and which figure you are and all that.
On the other hand, it's very useful.
It's useful to play Monopoly. It's useful to play Monopoly.
I'm the
Exactly.
racehorse.
Yeah.
Okay.
But when you see what's actually going on, you see the way these things are all games.
Right.
You know? And you can play the game of being a functional person in the 21st century America, or you can play the game of being a headhunter in the jungles of Brazil, or you can play the game of anything you want, and they're all just equally games, and none of them are true or untrue.
So Steve, you can just start laughing every time you say, "Oh, it's 9 o'clock."
Pull the other one.
But yeah, for a while, whenever I drank out of a cup, I always found it hysterical because the cup wasn't real, the drink wasn't real, the liquid going into my body, and it just seemed really, really hysterical.
Yeah.
Really
It's not real, but it's not unreal either.
right.
It's not negated. It's just a nexus of infinite dimensions, and each relative dimension has a different implicational framework.
Well, that's because you always use the glass as an example. You hold the glass. Do that. Yeah, there you go.
The sacred glass.
The sacred glass you
Glass.
can't use.
The glass sitting on your altar. See
Yeah.
that?
So you talked about playing those different games like the Headhunter and whatever. So say you're in the experience of being in between different interpretive frameworks, right? So like in terms of what to do, whatever. I'm always wondering about motivation, and so
Motivation is inherent.
well,
It's either there or it's not.
It seems like there's an interpretive framework, several different interpretive frameworks that, okay, do something because there's a sense that you have to because of whatever belief about the way someone should go about one's life, you know.
But even so, even in that context, the actual motivation is not generated by the interpretive framework. The motivation is inherent. You may be the kind of person that just completely rebels and resists. The interpretive framework may imply that it's important that you do this, but you may be a person that says, no, that's wrong. I'm not going to. I'm going to go live under a bridge, you know, or whatever. I mean, I don't know. So, in other words, the inherent motivation is actually inherent. It's inherent in the nature of your energy system, you could say, whatever that means. So, you know, this is why. So you even though certain interpretational frameworks may seem to stress or emphasize certain motivational contexts, that you can't actually create them. So, you know, suppose you've been playing Monopoly and you've been going along with the game playing Monopoly, and suppose you discover all of a sudden, oh my God, this is just a game. I've been thinking this was my life, but it's just a game. And so you get it from the board, and someone looks at you and says, hey, it's your turn. You can either sit back down and roll the dice, or you can get up and walk away. And what you do is not dependent upon the frame of interpretation. It's dependent upon your inherent motivation, your inherent orientation.
Nature.
It's not a matter of whether I see clearly or not.
Well, that may enter into the transaction, especially if there's ambiguity in terms of if your vector is going here, and then the available apparent vectors are here, they're pretty close to your vectors, so there's not going to be a lot of conflict. But if your inherent vector is going that way, and the vector is implied by the interpretational frameworks going this way, then all of a sudden lots of conflict and a big problem. And all of a sudden it becomes more of a dichotomy.
But even there, it's only an apparent dichotomy.
Well, in terms of in terms of apparent functionality.
Yeah, but that's, again, interpreting. So,
Well, maybe.
But there's a way of surfing in that, right, in those moments, right?
Yes and no. But you can't really surf your own motivation except to the degree your motivation has ambiguities in it.
mm,
You can surf interpretational framework. In other words, you can play different games, but it's always going to be you playing the games. And depending upon your nature, some people are more mercurial, and so their motivational vectors, you might say, are more amorphous, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, this is all a metaphor. It's not literally like that. But some people are more monomaniacal or more, let's say, obsessive in terms of having an inherent motivation.
It seemed like I used to have more of a clear motivation and stuff, and that's and I can't find it in the same way that it used to be.
Well, that's interesting. You can check into that.
How does that feel?
That sounds like an interesting thing to explore.
Feels strange. And feels like, oh, sometime they'll come back or another one will show up.
Well, maybe so.
Maybe not.
How about just that kind of not so motivated, so to speak, not so defined like that?
Sure.
Like that.
It seems like there should be some there's, so I keep on looking for it.
Well, should is definitely a sign of interpretive framework.
Uh-huh.
Should means relative to some context or relative to some principles, all of which are kind of abstracted into or asserted into existence. I mean, is ultimately much more interesting and more powerful than should. Maybe there should be a motivation, but what there is what's more potent ultimately.
Yeah.
When you get to should, you're already lost.
Yeah, you're already in fantasy land.
You're in fantasy.
You're already in that case.
even that case is not that bad.
Sort of like that expression, woulda, coulda,
I got used to it.
shoulda.
More fun, actually.
Well, see, this is another aspect of it when you're looking at interpretational frameworks as we are. It's easy to have the simplistic notion that the interpretive frameworks are the opposite of actuality or reality, but that's not the case. They exist in the context of actuality, but they exist and they're spontaneously generated by let's say, the human modes of consciousness or whatever that is. So in realization, interpretive frameworks don't disappear, but they're known to be arbitrary, and at that point, you can dip into them and use them to your own advantage to whatever degree you're motivated to, and to whatever degree you have facility in doing that.
But it sounds like they run themselves out, like with your example about time. Instead of this like a path that.
Well, it may or may not. You may see through it, but that doesn't necessarily negate other versions of those things. He may see the irrelevance of time, but he can meet someone at 9:30 tomorrow.
No. My mind here.
So,
Yeah.
in other words, these game structures can exist within the context of actuality without that fact being a problem whatsoever at all. The trick is to know that they're arbitrary, and then you're not trapped by them. Then you can use them or not at your convenience, but you're not a slave to them by believing that you're stuck in them or that they have some urgency or importance in their own terms. Whether someone's playing Monopoly has no importance whatsoever, and you are free to play or not, but it has no importance whatsoever.
Well, it's kind of interesting, without time, things, you say, happen in their own way. Like, I get up in the morning and there's this whole little ritual that happens at my house with my mom and getting her going and all that sort of thing. And it's just, the motivations, like you say, are just inherent in the day. The light coming in a certain way, her wanting to be fed, me, that's how I get things going, you see. All of this is all like just tied together in shapes and forms and colors
And it happens to be that way because it happens to be that way.
yeah.
And if it was different, it would be different.
Man, it's very beautiful that way, and so I can deal with that in terms of time if I wanted to, but it's so much more interesting just to feel the thing and just be it really,
Yeah, you're just surfing the energy, so to speak. And ultimately, that's all that's ever happening. All functioning, all of these interpretive frameworks and game structures are all just rationalizations and apologisms after the fact. All actual functioning is always just free form direct energy engagement.
It's called flow.
Yeah, all functioning is by flow. And you may have rationalizations of what you claim to be doing, your spin doctorings. Oh, what I'm doing now is such and such because of such and such, which is really important because of such and such. It's like, yeah, but that's not really true. What you're doing is what you're doing because you happen to be doing it. And if you were someone else, you would be doing something else, probably.
It's nice. I hate to say it, but if you were me, you probably wouldn't be doing anything. They never do nothing. I try. You think you're doing that?
That's his rationalization.
It's your interpretive framework of all the things you do.
I've been making a lot of great food. In large quantities.
Yeah, Peter, you're always doing something, right? And
You would say that?
you're saying your days are always filled up with things, but you not like you plan or think about like trying to get inspired to something.
I don't know. I mean, it's what seems to happen is describable in all sorts of ways. And sometimes I grapple with things, or sometimes I'm confused by things, or sometimes I'm in in some kind of a quandary, or sometimes I'm, I could be described as being, ambiguous about whether I want to do this or that, and feeling frustrated about it, or it can be described in all sorts of ways. But all those descriptions are inaccurate. And what's actually happening cannot be said. You can say it's the energy of reality dancing with itself, which is describable in all these other different ways, but that doesn't make it so.
I feel like making some sort of comparison with like my grandma who doesn't have that external structure that she used to, which is and she's just bored all the time, not doing much of anything, watching TV and nothing good is on. And it seems very different than your experience or what I present to you. And it seems like there's a lot of people who, without that external structure of they need to do things like get a job or something and responsibilities or have to
but
raise kids.
All of that is defined into existence by an interpretive framework, and boredom, because of lack of that, is defined into existence because of the same interpretive framework. Boredom has to be actively asserted.
Your grandmother
It has to be
bored
created.
watching TV?
Yeah. The experience is never boring. It has to be held as being boring. It has to be asserted as being boring. In other words, boredom has to be a condition that is shoehorned into the context of actual experience, which is always just boring. I don't know. Is it fascinating? I don't know. Is it weird? I don't know. So in other words, to come down with the value, with any kind of value assessment to any degree whatsoever, is always a symptom of an interpretive framework, which is always a symptom of assertion, of creation. You have to claim that it's so, and if you adhere to that, then you're believing it's so. You have a kind of a investment in it being so. You have some sense of it. It's important to maintain that it's so. So it's important. If your grandmother feels bored, it's important to her to feel bored. So she's actually being very productive, creating a condition of boredom. And she's fulfilling that role perhaps very well.
But describing it that way is in itself an interpretive thing, and it's very subtle to remember that that it's her nature, or it's the nature of the flow of what we're describing as your grandmother, that boredom happens and TV happens, and sitting in the chair in front of the TV happens.
Sure. In addition to the interpretive framework, holding it that way happens.
Exactly. It's part of the flow of all of that happening, gestalt happening all at once.
Yeah.
And when that changes, it'll change, and it doesn't have anything to do with your grandmother, the TV, boredom, or anything else.
Yeah, but we're looking at deconstructing the structure of what makes up a thing.
I understand.
We're not looking at why it is that way.
Right.
Which is a separate thing.
Seeing
I mean,
bigger.
this kind of spiritual inquiry is something that happens because it's happening. Why is it happening? I don't know. It's happening. Why are you here? I don't know. You're here. You don't know why you're here. I mean, you could probably come up with a narration, but it would just be it would be hot air. It's mysterious. Why isn't your grandmother here? Why wasn't she at a meeting like this 40 years ago? Can't answer that question. Why are you here? Can't answer that question. I mean, why some people come to this inquiry, you can't answer it. Why are most members of the electorate dupes getting manipulated by obviously lying and shallow posers of politicians? And why don't they see through it? I don't know. Why do some people question it and see through it? I don't know. But it happens to be that it is possible to see through it. And that's what spirituality is. It happens to be that it is possible to inquire into these things. And it happens to be that as a result of that inquiry, one can discover some drastic shifts in apparent perspectives that may or may not be useful, and may or may not have implication that has value. But it doesn't mean that you have to. It doesn't even mean that you should. It doesn't mean that even that you're doing it. It just means that this is an engagement which can happen, and if it can happen successfully, and that's interesting. So that's what really brings up, the whole why something particular happens as opposed to something else is ultimately a complete mystery.
It's a moot point too. I mean, just really notice that it's a moot point.
Sure.
If your grandmother could be doing something else, she would be doing something else, because that would be your grandmother. And that's apparently not. She's in front of the TV in the chair pretending to be bored.
Maybe she is doing something else.
Yeah.
Maybe you only think she's bored.
Yeah, maybe that's your interest.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. I mean,
that's what her claim is.
she's,
Well,
it's like my granddaughter or my kid. I'm bored.
Yeah, maybe her claim to be bored is actually a multidimensional indulgence in unutterable richness, and she's sitting there chuckling to herself, reveling in how bored she is.
And wrapping you around the little finger.
I mean, who knows? I mean, the point isn't that any of these questions are answerable.
No, right.
The point is to show that it's all an open question. You can never tell what's happening.
When I was a kid, the cousin of my next door neighbor came, and all of us, all these kids, like 8 kids, we used the Monopoly board for a game called horse racing, where we each had a different item and rolled dice, and saw who could. It was like a completely different interpretive framework from
the same board game.
Yeah. Oh my God, we love it so much.
Yeah.
But you see that in social situations.
Yes.
You can have a gathering of 10 people and they're each playing a different game. One
Yeah.
person's playing a game of social manipulation. Another person's playing a game of interpersonal entrapment. I mean, who knows what,
Right.
So people can be playing.
Enjoyment.
People can look like they're in a milieu playing the same game and actually be playing very different things.
And Peter's one of the 10 people in the corner laughing and pointing. Fun!
Anyhow, it's about quitting time, so.
It's not about quitting time. It is quitting
is
time.
quitting time.
So good night, friend.
Hey, so
Online
that
friend.
worked out pretty well. And it did. Was anybody on?